The first warning was not the bomb. It was the smell. A Japanese dive bomber had come in low over the gray water, so low that the sailors on the afterdeck saw the exhaust stains along its cowling before they saw the pilot's face. It clipped the carrier's island, tore open one wing, and slammed sideways across the crash net without exploding. The bomb was still under the belly. The pilot was dead. And from the split wing tank, a pale stream of aviation gasoline began running down the deck. Chief Bosun's mate, Frank Malloy, was the first man close enough to catch it. He expected the usual sting of fuel. Dirty, sharp, heavy with refinery bite. But this did not smell like battlefield gasoline. It smelled too clean. Like hospital solvent, like a laboratory cabinet, like something a chemist would label before he would burn it. Malloy grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a dented wardroom coffee urn, and shoved it under the leak. By the time the damage crew pushed the wreckage over the side, the urn held a little less than 3 gallons of enemy fuel. Not enough to power anything. Enough to frighten the Pacific Fleet. Because 2 days later, that coffee urn was sitting on a steel bench inside a Navy petroleum lab at Pearl Harbor, and the first man who opened it did not ask where the plane had come from. He asked one question: why does Japanese fuel smell cleaner than ours? By April 1945, the answer should have been impossible. Japan was supposed to be starving for fuel. American submarines had cut the tanker routes from the south. Bombers had been tearing at refineries. Pilots were being sent into the air with less training, less maintenance, and less chance of coming home. Every intelligence summary said the same thing in different words. Japan could still fight, but its aviation fuel system was collapsing. That was the assumption. Then Commander Nathan Rowe watched a glass hydrometer float in the enemy sample and saw a number that did not belong in a dying fuel program. American 100-octane combat gasoline usually sat near 0.695 specific gravity at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, low enough to indicate a clean, high-performance blend. A degraded fuel, one stretched with heavy fractions or poor substitutes, should read higher. 0.71, 0.72, sometimes worse. The Japanese sample read 0.692. Rowe stared at the column. He made the technician run it again. 0.692. A second bottle, filled from the same urn, read 0.691. That meant the fuel from a suicide aircraft was not heavier. It was lighter, cleaner, more tightly refined than the control sample sitting beside it. For a moment, nobody in the lab spoke. Then Rowe said, "Pull the Navy fuel from storage. Same test, same temperature." The American sample came back within specification. Good fuel, wartime fuel, the kind that had helped carry Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, Liberators, and B-29s across half the world. But it was not cleaner than the Japanese fuel in the coffee urn. That was the first crack in the story the Navy thought it understood. The second crack came from the chromatograph. Aviation gasoline is not just gasoline. It is a controlled argument between chemistry and violence. Inside a combat engine, fuel has to burn hard without detonating too early. If it detonates too early, the engine knocks. If the engine knocks badly enough under combat power, pistons can crack, bearings can hammer themselves apart, and an aircraft that still has wings becomes a falling object. That is why 100-octane fuel mattered. It let engines take more boost, more manifold pressure, more emergency power when the fight had no room left for caution. The United States had spent years and an industrial fortune building the refining system to make that fuel by the oceanful. Cracking units, alkylation plants, tetraethyl lead blending, quality control, tank farms, pipelines, the whole hidden empire behind a fighter pilot pushing the throttle past the safe mark. Japan was not supposed to have anything comparable left. Not in quantity, not at quality, not in April 1945, and certainly not for aircraft that were never meant to return. That was what made the coffee urn dangerous. A Kamikaze was not a prestige aircraft. It was a one-way weapon. If a nation is truly running out of refined aviation fuel, it does not pour its best gasoline into a machine it expects to lose in 10 minutes. It saves that fuel for interceptors, for night fighters, for the few veteran pilots still defending the home islands. War logistics can be cruel, but they are rarely irrational. So if the fuel in that urn was elite, one of two things had to be true. Either American intelligence had underestimated what Japan could still refine, or Japan had decided that the suicide program deserved its best chemistry. Neither answer was comforting. Lieutenant Ruth Avery ran the fraction analysis just after midnight. The lab windows were blacked out. The fans were off because the vibration spoiled readings. A cup of coffee went cold beside the instrument while the first trace crawled across the paper. Avery had expected a rough blend. A little high-performance stock, a little stretched base gasoline, a little desperation hidden inside the numbers. Instead, the chart showed a fuel blended with discipline. A high isooctane fraction, clean alkylate, low contamination, no obvious pine root extender, no heavy smear of panic chemistry. It looked less like a country scraping barrels and more like a country rationing excellence. Rowe read the trace twice. Then he asked the question that would keep him in the lab until morning. Where are they getting the alkylate? Alkylate was the prize. In wartime aviation gasoline, it was one of the cleanest ways to get high octane without turning the fuel into a dirty compromise. But making it was not simple. It required specialized vessels, controlled temperature, dangerous acid catalysts, trained operators, and enough industrial confidence to reject a bad batch, even when every gallon mattered. That last part mattered most. A starving fuel system does not throw away imperfect gasoline. It uses it. It labels it good enough. It sends it forward and hopes the engine holds. The Japanese sample had not been treated that way. It had been trimmed, corrected, finished. At 2 in the morning, Avery produced the first catalyst fingerprint. The pattern did not match the simpler sulfuric acid process the Americans expected from a resource-constrained plant. It matched hydrofluoric acid alkylation. The harder route, the cleaner route, the route associated with the best allied high-performance fuel units. Rowe wrote only 4 words in the margin of the worksheet. Not emergency production. The third test was the one no one could argue away. Composition could imply performance. Density could suggest it. But octane had to be measured under load. The sample was fed into a standardized test engine, a single-cylinder machine built to knock on command and tell the truth about fuel. The American control fuel ran as expected, a lean mixture rating just over 100, a rich mixture performance number in the low 130s, exactly what a frontline aircraft wanted. Then the Japanese fuel went in. The needle climbed, the engine held. The knock curve stayed flat longer than it should have. The first run gave a rich mixture performance number just under 140. The second run came back within a hair of it. Not a miracle, not magic, just chemistry doing its work. But in an air battle, that difference could mean a few more seconds of full emergency power, a steeper final dive, a tighter correction before impact, an engine that did not cough during the only run that mattered. The fuel was part of the weapon. That was the turn. Not simply that Japan still had good gasoline. That would have been bad enough. The real discovery was colder. The suicide aircraft were not being fueled with leftovers. They were being supplied as priority weapons, with carefully finished fuel designed to keep an engine alive right up to the moment the aircraft was destroyed. A one-way pilot did not need fuel for the trip home.
But he did need enough reliable power to reach the ship. Enough anti-knock margin to dive at full throttle.
Enough volatility control to start cleanly in coastal weather and run hard over open water. Enough chemical precision that the last mechanical failure would not happen 10 seconds before impact. That changed how the Navy looked at the attacks. It meant the Kamikaze was not only a human decision, it was a logistics decision, a refinery decision, a quality control decision. Somewhere in Japan, chemists and plant operators were feeding the suicide campaign as deliberately as armorers fitted the bombs. By the fourth day, the lead analysis came back. Tetraethyl lead was the anti-knock additive that made much of wartime high-octane fuel possible. Too little, and the engine knocked. Too much, and the spark plugs fouled, valves suffered, deposits formed, and reliability collapsed. The art was not simply adding lead. The art was stopping at the edge. The Japanese sample measured 4 milliliters per U.S. gallon, exactly at the practical ceiling used for high-grade aviation fuel. Not roughly, not close, not safely under. 4. Avery checked the titration. A second technician checked her work. Rowe ordered a third run from an unopened bottle. 4 again. He did not smile. He looked tired. Because precision like that meant paperwork. It meant calibration. It meant inspection stations. It meant a system still organized enough to care about the last decimal point. A broken industry does not behave that way. A broken industry pours, prays, and ships. This industry was still measuring. On the 5th day, the lab stopped treating the sample as an oddity and started treating it as intelligence. The chemists wrote down what the fuel itself implied. Not what pilots had reported. Not what prisoners had guessed. Not what old maps showed. What the molecules said. The fuel suggested a small but capable production stream. Not mass volume, not American volume. Something narrower, protected, prioritized, technically sophisticated. High-grade alkylate blended with limited conventional stocks, leaded to the ceiling, finished with care, and allocated to missions where a single engine failure could mean the difference between a splash in the water and a burning hole in a carrier deck. Rowe summarized it in one sentence during the morning briefing. They are not drowning in fuel. Then he corrected himself. They are choosing where the clean fuel goes. That sentence moved faster than the report. By evening, the petroleum lab's findings were being compared against aerial photographs, prisoner interrogations, bomb damage surveys, and signals fragments from the inland sea. The pattern began to narrow. Certain plants that had been listed as low-value coal processing sites were suddenly worth another look. A facility near Uve. Smaller units near chemical works that had been filed under fertilizer, solvents, or synthetic byproducts. Industrial sites that did not look like the great American refining complexes because they did not need to. They were not trying to feed an empire of aircraft. They were feeding a priority list. Interceptors, special attack units, aircraft whose missions were selected, briefed, fueled, and launched with the knowledge that they would spend everything in one final burn. That made the production small, but not unimportant. A gallon of that fuel did not need to serve a campaign for months. It needed to carry one aircraft through the last minutes of its life. And in that narrow role, quality mattered more than volume. The target officers did not like chemical uncertainty. They liked shipyards, airfields, bridges, factories you could see clearly from altitude. But the chemistry report changed the argument. A plant that produced only a trickle of high-grade aviation components might be more dangerous than its size suggested, because that trickle was going straight into the aircraft the fleet feared most. Not every facility became a priority overnight. Not every photo was clear. War does not turn evidence into action cleanly, but the list changed. Chemical plants that had sat below the main target tier moved upward. Rail spurs and storage tanks near synthetic fuel works got circled in red. Aerial reconnaissance asked new questions, not just, where is the refinery, but where is the blend stream? Where are the acid units? Where are the tank cars moving small volumes that do not match the rest of the plant? Where is the invisible fuel hiding inside ordinary industry? That was the strange thing about the coffee urn. It did not contain much fuel. A sailor could lift it with 2 hands, but it carried a map the Americans had not drawn. The density told them the blend was clean. The chromatograph told them the chemistry was controlled. The octane engine told them the performance was real. The lead measurement told them the quality system was alive. And the mission itself told them the most important thing of all. Japan was willing to spend its best remaining aviation fuel on pilots it knew would not return. That was not desperation without structure. That was desperation organized into a weapon. Weeks later, when B-29 crews crossed the Japanese coast and turned toward industrial targets around the inland sea, most of the men aboard did not know about the coffee urn. They knew coordinates, flak estimates, wind at altitude, bomb load, fuel for the return leg. They did not know that a damaged wing tank, a sailor's nose, and a laboratory full of tired chemists had helped shift attention toward chemical plants that looked too small to matter. That is how technical intelligence often works. No speech, no headline, no single heroic moment, just an object saved before it evaporates. A number that refuses to fit, a chemist who trusts the instrument more than the assumption, and a war plan quietly changes shape. Frank Malloy never saw the final report. He went back to the deck, back to fires, nets, stretchers, hoses, and the endless gray horizon. Ruth Avery kept one worksheet copy folded inside a notebook until the humidity curled the paper. Commander Rowe wrote the clean version of the conclusion in language careful enough for admirals. The examined sample indicates restricted but technically competent, high-grade aviation fuel production, with likely allocation to selected air defense and special attack missions. That was the official sentence. What he said to Avery after signing it was simpler. They're using good fuel for dead men. The coffee urn disappeared, probably scrubbed, probably returned to wardroom service, maybe thrown out when the dent in its side made it useless. The aircraft was gone before the report was typed. The pilot's name was never recovered, but the fuel had already spoken for him. It said his engine had not been fed with the scraps of a collapsing empire. It had been fed with the product of a working chemical system, small, strained, hidden, and still dangerous. The Navy had expected bad gasoline and found precision. It had expected exhaustion and found allocation. It had expected a suicide weapon made only from despair and found a weapon finished by engineers. The pilot never knew any of that. He knew only the sound in front of him, the throttle forward, the engine pulling clean, the sea rising, and the ship growing larger until there was no more distance left to burn.